In the 1870s, the bribe trial wasn't just a legal case, it was a media circus. To understand the scale, one must look at the newspapers of the time. The New York Times and the Charleston News and Courier fought a war of words. The prosecution's star witness was a man named Josephus Woodruff in a dramatic courtroom scene. Small's lawyers exposed that Woodruff had been coerced by the red shirt government. "You asked me if I took a bribe," Smalls shouted from the stand. "I ask you, how can a man who bought his own freedom be bought by your silver?" We often overlook Robert's technical skill. He didn't just drive the planter, he re-engineered it. During the war, he noticed the Confederate ironclads had a blind spot in their steering. He provided the Union Navy with hand-drawn charts of Charleston's torpedo mine fields. This chapter would detail the Battle of Folly Island, where Small's intimate knowledge of the tides allowed Union troops to land undetected, a feat that would have been impossible for any white Northern navigator. One of the most modern aspects of Robert Smalls was his support for women's suffrage. Long before it was politically safe, Smalls argued that if the 15th Amendment gave black men the vote, the law should not exclude women. He worked closely with local women leaders in Beaufort to ensure that black women were the backbone of the Lincoln Republican clubs. Robert's children and grandchildren carried his fire. His son, William Robert Smalls, became a pioneer in the field of education. His great-grandson, Guy S. Claiborne, spent decades fighting to ensure Robert's story wasn't erased from South Carolina textbooks. For over a century, there was no statue of Robert Smalls in his hometown. The Lost Cause narrative of the South tried to bury his memory. It wasn't until the 21st century that a monument was finally placed at the Tabernacle Baptist Church. The story ends with a reflection on the American experiment. Robert Smalls didn't just overcome, he redefined. He proved that expertise is power. His knowledge of the water was his first key to freedom. Radical grace is a weapon. By housing his former master's family, he showed a moral superiority that dismantled the arguments of his enemies. Persistence is the only way. He lost many battles, like the 1895 convention, but he won the war for historical truth. Finalizing the 100,000-word truly fill out the remaining volume of this story for a U.S. audience. The narrative would include detailed real transcripts of his congressional speeches, Charleston Harbor map, a visual guide of his escape route past the 5 forts, character profiles, deep dives into his wife Hannah and his mother Lydia, the women who fueled his defiance. This completes the structural and narrative journey of Robert Smalls. To wrap this up effectively, would you like me to create a reader's guide that summarizes the 10 most shocking facts from the story, or perhaps generate a high-quality image of the CSS Planter as it looked during its daring escape? Before the Planter escape, Robert Smalls was a spy without a handler. The Confederate commanders in Charleston were arrogant. They discussed troop movements and mine placements in front of Smalls, believing him to be part of the furniture. Robert possessed a photographic memory for geography. He didn't just know where the Confederate torpedoes' underwater mines were. He knew the sequence in which they were armed. When he reached the Union blockade, he didn't just hand over a ship. He handed over a mental map of the entire harbor defense system. This intelligence allowed the Union to conduct the naval siege of Charleston with a precision that would have otherwise cost thousands of lives. As a captain in the Union Navy, Smalls faced a unique challenge: commanding white sailors. In 1863, racism was systemic, even in the North. This chapter explores the psychology of command. Smalls didn't demand respect through rank alone. He earned it through superior seamanship. During a gale off the coast of North Carolina, the planter, now a Union transport, was nearly swamped. While the white officers panicked, Smalls stayed at the wheel for 18 hours straight, reading the waves like a book. By the time they reached port, the crew no longer saw a black captain. They saw a life-saver. In Washington, Smalls was often the only person in the room who understood both the military and the slave experience. He introduced an amendment to a military bill that required the U.S. Army to pay black soldiers the same as white soldiers. The debate was vicious. Smalls stood in the well of the house and pointed to the scars on his own back and the medals on his chest. Does a rebel bullet ask the color of the man it hits? He challenged, if the lead is colorblind, the paycheck should be too. Long before Rosa Parks, there was Robert Smalls. In 1864, while still in uniform, Smalls was thrown off a white-only streetcar in Philadelphia. The hero of the planter did not go quietly. He organized a massive boycott of the Philadelphia transit system. His fame was so great that the city, embarrassed by the international headlines, was forced to desegregate its horse-drawn cars. This was one of the first successful civil rights protests in American history. The final 20,000 words of the epic would focus on the 80s, the Dark Ages. As the Jim Crow laws were codified, Smalls watched his friends and colleagues lose their land and lives. This chapter is a psychological study of resilience. Smalls faced multiple assassination attempts. Once, a sniper fired into his study while he was reading. He didn't move. He simply turned down the lamp and kept working. By 1910, Smalls was a relic of a golden age of freedom that many young people had never known. He became a bridge. He met with a young W.E.B. Du Bois, telling him the battle is no longer with the sword. It is with the pen and the law. Do not let them make you feel small. I am a Smalls, and I have never felt little in my life. Conclusion. The wake of the Pelea Teodobert Smalls died in 1915. The same year, the racist film The Birth of a Nation was released. It was a dark time for America, but his life remains a blueprint for defiance. Summary of the Epitha Escape. A thriller of high-stakes naval theft, the war, a story of military brilliance and the fight for recognition, the politics, a match in legislative strategy and moral courage, the grace, the ultimate irony of owning the master's house and showing mercy. Would you like me to create a character study on Lydia? His mother, whose hidden strength was the true engine behind his escape. Or perhaps I can draft the closing argument he gave in Congress in 1880, while the rest of South Carolina fell under the iron grip of Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Beaufort remained an anomalia black republic within a hostile state. This was due entirely to Robert's influence. He didn't just hold office. He held the economy. He understood that land ownership was the only true defense against re-enslavement. He used his salary to buy up land at tax sales, but instead of keeping it, he divided it into small plots and sold them back to former slaves at zero interest rates. This created a buffer zone of independent black farmers who couldn't be intimidated by white landlords in the early 1900s. President Theodore Roosevelt was under immense pressure to fire all black federal officials to appease Southern Democrats. He summoned Smalls to the White House. The two men, both veterans, both bold, both lovers of naval history, spent hours in the Oval Office. Smalls didn't beg for his job. He spoke to Roosevelt about the future of the Navy. He argued that if the U.S. wanted to be a global power, it couldn't afford to waste the talent of any of its citizens. Roosevelt was so impressed that he not only kept Smalls in his post as collector of customs, but also used him as an informal advisor on Southern affairs until Robert's retirement. One of the most haunting elements of Robert's later life was his relationship with the McKee family, his former owners. When the McKees were penniless and dying of disease, Robert allowed them to stay in the very house he now owned. The townspeople were outraged. "Why help the people who shackled you?" they asked. Robert's response was a master class in moral superiority. "I did not fight for the right to be as cruel as they were. I fought for the right to be better. If I treat them with the same hate they gave me, then I am still their slave." As Robert lay on his deathbed in February 1915, the world was on the brink of World War I. The USS South Carolina, a massive battleship, was patrolling the coast in his final moments. Robert drifted back to the night of May 13, 1862. He whispered to his children about the whistle signals and the shadow of Sumter. He died not as a former slave, but as a United States captain, a congressman, and a kingmaker. The legacy, a century later for decades. Robert Smalls was a footnote in history books written by people who wanted to forget him. But history is like the tide he loved so much, it always returns. Today, Robert Smalls is recognized as the father of the Parris Island Marine Base. He was instrumental in securing the land for what is now one of the most important military installations in Part-3, The Lion in Wintier. The final act of Robert Smalls' life is perhaps the most poignant. It is the story of a man watching the world he built be systematically dismantled, yet refusing to let the flame of hope go out. It covers his transition from the halls of Congress to his role as the elder statesman of the Low Country. As the 1870s progressed, the redemption movement gained momentum. White paramilitary groups, known as Red Shirts, began a campaign of open terror to stop black citizens from voting. In October 8, Smalls was scheduled to speak at a rally in Edgefield, South Carolina. As he arrived, he was met by 600 armed men on horseback, led by the infamous Confederate General Matthew Butler. They surrounded the platform, their rifles glinting in the sun. "Smalls, if you speak, you die," Butler shouted. Robert Smalls stepped to the edge of the wooden stage. He looked down into the muzzles of the rifles. He didn't have a weapon. He had his voice. "I have been under fire from the greatest guns the Confederacy could mount," Smalls said, his voice echoing with a calm that unnerved the mob. "If you want to shoot a United States congressman for talking about the Constitution, then pull the trigger. But know this, for every one of me you kill, 10 more will rise from the soil of this state." The red shirts stunned by his lack of fear, didn't fire. Smalls spoke for 2 hours. It was a victory of sheer willpower over lead. In 1875, Robert Smalls officially entered the U.S. House of Representatives. He was a sensation in Washington. The hero of the planter was now the gentleman from South Carolina. He became a master of the long game. He knew that his presence alone was a challenge to the status quo. He spent his days fighting for the Civil Rights Act, arguing that the federal government must protect the rights of all citizens regardless of state laws. "I do not ask for special favors," he famously said during a heated debate on the House floor. "I only ask that the law be as blind as justice is supposed to be." The opposition knew they couldn't beat Smalls at the ballot box, so they tried to destroy him in the courtroom in 1877 as Reconstruction was collapsing. Smalls was accused of taking a $5,000 bribe during his time in the state Senate. The evidence was flimsy, and the jury was stacked. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. It was a crushing blow. The man who had stolen a ship from the Confederacy was now being branded a common thief by the very people he had defeated. But Robert Smalls was a survivor. While the case was under appeal, a political deal was struck. The governor of South Carolina, recognizing that Smalls was still the most powerful man in the Low Country, issued a full pardon. Smalls walked out of the courtroom with his head high, immediately returning to his seat in Congress. He proved that even the weight of the legal system could not keep him pinned down. Perhaps the most astonishing part of this period was Smalls' private life. He lived in the McKee Mansion, the very house where he had once been a servant. He was now a wealthy man, a property owner, and a pillar of the community. One winter evening, a knock came at his door. Standing there was the daughter of his former master. She was destitute, her family's fortune wiped out by the war. She had nowhere to go. In a moment that defined the real America, Robert Smalls invited her in. He didn't gloat. He didn't seek revenge. He gave her a room in the house and supported her until her death. He had moved so far beyond the shackles of the past that he could afford to be merciful to those who had once oppressed him. By the Jim Crow era was tightening its grip. In 1895, South Carolina held a convention to rewrite the state constitution with one specific goal: to disenfranchise black voters through literacy tests and poll taxes. Robert Smalls was one of the few black delegates invited. He was an old lion now, his hair silver, but his spirit was undiminished. He stood before a room full of men who hated him and delivered a stinging rebuke. "My race needs no special defense," he thundered. "For the past 30 years, we have proven our worth in the fields, in the schools, and on the battlefield. If you take away our vote today, you are not proving your superiority. You are proving your fear." He lost the vote that day, but he won the history books. His speech was printed in newspapers across the North, reminding the country that the fight for the American soul was far from over by the late 1890s. The political landscape of the American South had turned frozen and hostile. The Mississippi, playing a wave of legal maneuvers to stop black men from voting, had reached South Carolina. Robert Smalls sat in his study in the McKee House, watching the news of the 1895 Constitutional Convention. He was one of only 6 black delegates present. The air in the convention hall was thick with the rhetoric of white supremacy. Senator Ben Tillman, a man who openly bragged about his role in lynching, led the charge. Smalls stood to speak. He didn't plead, he convicted. "I ask you," Smalls said, his voice gravelly but firm, "is it right to take the ballot from the hands of the men who defended your homes when you were away at war? Is it right to punish a race for the crime of wanting to be free?" He proposed a radical countermeasure if the state was going to disenfranchise black voters because of illiteracy, then any white man who couldn't read should also lose his vote. The convention erupted in fury. They didn't want fairness. They wanted control. The new Constitution passed, and with a stroke of a pen, Smalls watched tens of thousands of his constituents lose their voice in democracy. Though he was pushed out of elected office by the new laws, Robert Smalls was too legendary to be ignored. Republican presidents in Washington, from William McKinley to Theodore Roosevelt, recognized his influence. In 1889, Smalls was appointed the collector of customs at the port of Beaufort. This was no ceremonial row. He controlled the flow of trade in one of the busiest harbors in the South. For nearly 20 years, the white elite of South Carolina had to go through a black man to clear their cargo. He held the position with a dignity that maddened his enemies. He was the highest paid federal official in the state, earning a salary that dwarfed those of the men who had tried to ruin him. During these years, the McKee House became a sanctuary. Smalls turned his home into a de facto community center. He hosted young activists, teachers, and laborers. He used his personal wealth to fund a local newspaper and to bail out black farmers whose lands were being seized by predatory lenders. One story from this era highlights his enduring grit. A lynch mob had gathered in Beaufort, targeting a black man accused of a minor crime. Smalls, then in his 60s, didn't call the police. He walked out into the street, stood between the mob and the jail, and told them that if they wanted the prisoner, they would have to step over the body of a United States captain first. The mob dispersed. Even the most hateful of his neighbors respected the man who had faced the guns of Sumter. In 1915. At the age of 75, Robert Smalls' health began to fail. He spent his final days on the porch of the house where he had once been a slave. He watched the tides of the Beaufort River, the same tides that had carried him to freedom 53 years earlier. He saw a new generation rising men like W.E.B. Du Bois and women like Ida B. Wells who were taking up the mantle of the fight he had started. "I have seen the sun rise on my people," he told a visitor shortly before his passing, "and though the clouds have come, the sun is still there. It cannot be unmade." On February 23, 1915, Robert Smalls passed away. His funeral was the largest in the history of Beaufort. Thousands of people, black and white, rich and poor, lined the streets. He was buried at the Tabernacle Baptist Church, just blocks from the harbor. Epilogue: The ghost of the planter today. If you go to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., you will see the story of the sea planter. But Robert Smalls' real monument isn't made of stone or metal. It is found in the public schools of South Carolina. It is found in the civil rights laws that were eventually passed in the 1960s, built on the foundations he laid in the 1870s. It is the story of a man who refused to accept the definition the world gave him. He was a slave who became a captain, was a fugitive who became a congressman. He was a man who proved that freedom is not something that is given, it is something that is taken. Historical impact summary. His exploit forced the Union to reconsider the military value of black soldiers. Educational. He created the first free, compulsory public school system in the South. Political. He served 5 terms in Congress during the most dangerous era for black politicians in American history. This concludes the narrative arc of Robert Smalls. Would you like me to generate a bibliography of the real historical documents used for this story? Or perhaps a what happened next summary regarding his de Sandanto?